Welcome to Watercolor 101. In this video, we will be talking about supplies. Hi, I'm Madeline. When I first started out with watercolor, I did what I think most people did, and that is I hopped onto Amazon and I googled watercolor paper. What popped up for me were these spiral-bound books by Canson. I bought it along with some Cotman paints and started painting. Nothing against Canson or Cotman, but I didn't really understand my supplies. I was watching YouTube videos and everyone was saying it's good to paint on 100% cotton paper, and I just assumed the Canson sketchbook I had was 100% cotton. It in fact wasn't, and it took me a few months to really understand the difference. So a lot of commonly available watercolor pads or sketchbooks are usually made out of cellulose paper. What is cellulose paper? Cellulose paper is paper that's partially made up of tree pulp. It feels like cardstock, and it usually isn't advertised as cellulose paper, so you probably won't see it on the front of a sketchbook. So how do you know you have cellulose paper? Well, I actually had to Google it, and I didn't really find it anywhere on the cover of the sketchbook or on the company website. So the first and probably the greatest tip I have for you as we start off is to paint with 100% cotton watercolor paper. When you are buying paper, you need to look to make sure that the paper you are buying is 100% cotton. And it's not always the most widely advertised if it isn't. Most artists will also say make sure you use 140 pound 300 GSM, and those are just measurements that describe how thick the paper is, but the pounds and the GSM to me are not as crucial as having 100% cotton paper. You can have cellulose paper that is 140 pounds 300 GSM, and it will not perform the same as 100% cotton paper of those same weights. The main difference between cellulose paper and cotton paper is that 100% cotton paper has a better ability to hold and absorb water. And when it comes to watercolors, it actually affects how we paint. The more water our paper can hold, oftentimes the better the result we will get. For those who can afford to splurge a little, I recommend Arch's cold pressed paper. This is the one that most people use, and it has kind of a green cover. If you want a more affordable option that I feel performs almost as well as the expensive stuff, I recommend Bao Hong Academy Rough Grain. Academy just means that it's a student grade line. I'm going to quickly mention that with watercolor supplies, there are tiers. There are artist grade, which is considered professional and more expensive, and then there's student grade, which is more affordable. I also want to go over the fact that there are 3 different types of watercolor paper. Cold pressed, which has some texture, hot pressed, which is completely smooth, and then rough grain, which is very textured. Most people prefer cold pressed. Now that we know what kind of watercolor paper we want, the next supply to look at are paints. Now, I just want to caveat that there are dozens and dozens of different kinds of paints, and you could go down a deep rabbit hole watching YouTube videos on which ones are the best. At the end of the day, to me, it all comes down to personal preference. I am going to recommend paints that I have really enjoyed using. You may love them, you may hate them. At the end of the day, you can read all the watercolor reviews you want, but you won't really know what paints you like until you start using them. Watercolor comes in pans, which are like little squares of dried paint in a plastic or metal pan, and then they come in tubes, which have wet paint and can be squeezed out into palettes. Whether you choose pans or tubes will not make a really big difference in your watercolor experience. I personally prefer tubes because I like my paints more wet and I like to be able to squeeze the colors I want out into a palette. I am going to recommend some brands that I like, but I just want to remind you that I am a landscape artist. I paint very loosely, I love soft colors, and I love to blend. So the paint recommendations that I make are going to mostly cater to what I paint with my watercolor. So again, take my recommendations with a grain of salt. My favorite paint brand at the moment is M. Graham. They are a honey-based paint, which means the binder of the paint is made out of honey, and as a result, the paints kind of stay on the more wet side, and sometimes don't dry completely depending on how humid it is where you live. Because I like my paints on the more wet side, this brand probably isn't for you if you do a lot of traveling with your watercolors. I've read horror stories of this particular brand of paint spilling everywhere when you take your palette out to travel. I personally don't go anywhere and my paints are always on my desk, so it's not a problem for me, but I just wanted to give you that heads up. I believe M. Graham is an American company and can be found at most American art stores, including Amazon. A more affordable option of paints that perform pretty similarly to me are this brand Rosa Gallery paints. They are a Ukrainian paint company, and I purchased them off of an online art store in Spain called Arte Miranda. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I will provide links to all these supplies in the description of the video. I really enjoy these paints. They're just a couple bucks on Arte Miranda. I want to say they're like usually $3 to $4, and when they go on sale, it can go as down to like $1 or $2. You can get them on Amazon, but I feel like they're a lot more expensive on Amazon. So if you're not, too comfortable purchasing internationally, you can get both the tubes and the pans on Amazon. I do also want to mention, and I won't talk about this in depth too much, but there are also handmade paint companies, and these are usually smaller businesses that make their paints and sell them, and they're sometimes a little bit more expensive, but handmade paints are really nice. And they usually have more unique colors that you aren't able to find with the larger paint brands. Now that I've gone over a few brands of paints that I personally really like, the next thing I want to go over is just like what types of colors you should have in your palette. And so I've swatched out some basic colors that I think if you are starting out would be really helpful to have. So I think it's a good idea to have a light and a dark yellow. This is Naples yellow and yellow ochre. I think you need a cool and a warm red. So this is quinacridone rose, opera rose, and this is alizarian crimson, which is a warm red. The first two are cool reds. I like having a purple. You could easily mix your own purple, but I use purples often, so I like just having one in my palette. And then moving on to blue, this is ultramarine. That's my personal favorite blue to use. I also like anthracnone blue, which is the blue to the right of it. It's a little bit cooler, but generally ultramarine, cobalt blue, or even cerulean blue, those blues are really easy to mix with other colors. I find phthalo blue to be slightly difficult to mix. It's also a very staining color, so I haven't had the best luck with it, but ultramarine is a very solid blue to go with. Now we're going to move on to greens. I didn't have that much room on my swatch, so I only put one green. The green on this card is sap green, but I usually like perylene green as a second green to have. It's a pretty dark green. And then this is Payne's Gray, and at the very end it's neutral tint. And then after I swatched that, I realized that I had two more colors I wanted to add. So this is Sepia and Indigo. So these colors I would say are the basic colors that you would want in your color palette, and with this sort of spectrum of color, you'll be able to paint most things. And I just want to quickly mention paint palettes. So this is a ceramic paint palette, which I really like. They are easy to clean, easy to mix, and none of the paint beads on them. Like if you look, there's no beading of the paint. But another alternative are plastic paint palettes, which I actually also really love. This is a Mission Magello plastic paint palette, and the problem with plastic, or why a lot of artists don't like plastic, is because sometimes paints can bead, kind of like that right there. But actually I found that if you go over the plastic with like a cleaner, it kind of like takes off the plasticky shine, and then you don't really get as many issues with the paint beading. But yes, plastic palettes are great. Just YouTube how to prevent beading on plastic palettes. And last but not least, let's talk about watercolor brushes. So I do want to say, just like watercolor paints, there are lots of different brands of watercolor brushes. I'm going to be talking about the types of brushes you need and the brands that I like. This is a mop brush, and I think this is probably the brush that makes the most difference when I paint my very loose and soft watercolor backgrounds and landscapes. A mop brush has a very big belly and it can hold a lot of water and paint, and so it's really easy to get really large and soft brush strokes. The sizing of brushes kind of differ brand to brand, and the range can be quite great, but I generally like size 1 or size 0 mops for the size of watercolor paintings that I do. So a mop brush is definitely something that you need. And the next brush I want to talk about, which is sort of like the bread and butter of watercolor brushes, is a round brush. And a round brush is what you're going to do a lot of your illustration with. So if you look at it compared to the mop brush, the round brush has a thinner belly and it doesn't hold as much water as a mop brush, so it is a little bit easier to paint details with. But I would say both of these brushes are probably equally as important in my watercoloring. So make sure you get a mop and a round. A generic round size with most companies, I would say I use like a round 6. That's like a pretty medium-sized round. And in addition to these two brushes, I want to just go over a few more. So this is what I would call a synthetic detail brush. It's very fine, and this brush in particular, if you compare it to the round that I had earlier, this is much thinner. And so the smaller you go in brushes, the easier it is to paint details and finer lines. So I would say you need a medium round, like a round 6, and a smaller round, like a round 1 or round 2, and then a mop brush. And then these brushes right here are liner brushes, and liner brushes are really good for like really fine details. They have a long and thin belly, and I like to use my liners for painting birds and very fine lines. And then the very last brush I want to talk about is a flat brush. And this is a flat brush, and this is just a brush that makes it easy to wet your paper in kind of like a quick amount of brush strokes. So you're not spending like, 5 minutes getting your paper entirely wet. A flat brush is going to wet your paper pretty evenly, pretty quickly. And lastly, I want to quickly go over optional but very helpful supplies. So the first and probably my favorite optional supply is this hot air tool. You do not need it at all for watercolor. It's not like necessary, but it's like the best in terms of saving time. Like I wish I had one from the very beginning, because I used to just like paint and wait, which is fine if you want to paint and wait, but I paint all day long, and so this sort of helps me paint much more quickly. The next is masking fluid. Masking fluid is really fun. What it basically is kind of like a gummy latex kind of sticky thing that you can paint on your watercolor paper, and then once it dries you can paint over it, and it preserves the white space that you painted the masking fluid over, and then afterwards you can rub it off, and then you see the white paper that got preserved with the masking fluid. So this is like really fun to use for different types of watercolor techniques. The next is white gouache. I really like this brand. It's Dr. P.H. Martin's. It's bleed proof white gouache, and it comes in this little jar, and it's like the perfect for painting on like finishing details, or adding stars. But white gouache is generally like a really helpful thing to have. And I am going to talk about masking tape, because I use masking tape a lot when I do wet on wet technique, and I like a thin masking tape and a thicker masking tape. This is a brush cleaner, which I really like for cleaning my brushes. I try to clean my brushes once a month so that I kind of preserve the integrity of them. But that is it for my supplies video, and I hope that you found all of this very helpful. The next video in this series will be watercolor techniques. If you liked this video, please hit subscribe, and if you like my content, please check out my Patreon.